are four major attachment styles. Number one, the anxious attachment style. This individual usually has very loving parents, but they experience either real or perceived abandonment in their upbringing. Number two, the fearful avoidant. This attachment style is characterized by having a lot of chaos in childhoods. The overarching theme is like you never really know what you're going to get in your household. Sometimes there can be really loving and nice experiences, and other times there's like chaotic and a confusing experience. Number three, the dismissive avoidant. They grew up with this overarching theme of childhood emotional neglect. Biologically, we're wired for attunement and attentiveness from our caregivers. When that's not there, this child grows up to go, there must be something wrong with me. And number four, the securely attached style. The secure style is basically the style that we want everybody to become. They tend to do the best in relationships. They thrive the most in relationships, and they report not only the most long-lasting relationships, but also they report feeling happy and satisfied the most in their relationships. Most people nowadays are not securely attached, but the best news of all of this is that no matter what your attachment style is, you can heal to become securely attached, and it not only heals the relationship to yourself, but actually will.
Thais, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
So I was listening. So I had a long drive. I was kind of filling you in. I was listening to your YouTube channel, and a lot of times I like to listen to podcasts that you've done or the guest has done because it gives me your rhythm. It shows me, are you high energy like me? Are you a deep thinker? Do you develop I get an idea of the whole experience, but very rarely do I dive into the YouTube channel. But your attachment theory research was so cool that I was like, oh, I found myself trying to diagnose where I fit in or where I was to where I am today. Can you tell the listeners just right out of the gate what this is and how you've made this your life's work to this point?
Yes, definitely. So attachment theory was originally developed by John Bowlby out of Cambridge University and later Mary Ainsworth. And then, I actually learned about it in first year university back however many years ago that was, 16 years ago or so. And it was really high level, where it talked about how, our adult relationships have a big influence on how we learn to attach to others. But there was really not much discussion in terms of how we can change our attachment style, and not enough discussion, in my opinion, around how this actually affects our adult romantic relationships and even friendships, co-working relationships, family interactions as adults. And so this is where a lot of my research began, was diving into this a lot more deeply. And so there are four major attachment styles. I really like to think of our attachment style as this subconscious set of rules we have about how to give and receive love and how to connect with other people. And every single person has an attachment style. So this affects everybody on the planet. And the four attachment styles are: number one, the anxious attachment style; number two, the fearful avoidant; number three, the dismissive avoidant; and number four, the securely attached style. So if you'd like, I can kind of break down a little bit about each style and how they're really formed.
Yeah, I love it.
Awesome. So the secure style is basically the style that we want everybody to become, if they're not already. And for myself, I was definitely not a secure attachment style. It's quite rare nowadays for somebody to be securely attached through their upbringing. Research a few decades ago showed it was about 50% of the population, but now current research is showing that quite dramatically trending downwards. So we have the securely attached style. They develop because in childhood, they have what we call approach-oriented behaviors from their parents. So what this means is that if a child cries or it fusses or is upset, the caregiver or parent will go towards them and will try to soothe them and figure out what's going on. So there's this baseline in the background of what is known as attunement or presence from the caregiver. They're tapped into what the child is feeling and experiencing. Now, this may seem like a small thing, but it has a really huge impact, because when a child can't speak the language yet, can't understand that a caregiver is not going to just abandon them out of the blue, and knows they're completely dependent on their caregiver for survival, then having that caregiver be attentive, be there, be present, try to soothe you when you're crying, it actually gives a child in their upbringing all of this messaging or conditioning that says, I can trust other people. It's safe to rely on other people. It's safe to give and receive love. I am confident in who I am. I'm worthy of having my emotions expressed and seen and heard, and I can communicate, and that's safe. So statistically, we have securely attached children turn into securely attached adults, and they tend to do the best in relationships. They thrive the most in relationships, and they report not only the most long-lasting relationships, but also they report feeling happy and satisfied the most in their relationships. Most people nowadays are not securely attached. So this is where we have the 3 insecure attachment styles. At one end of the continuum, if you will, there is an anxious attachment style. This individual usually has very loving parents, but they experience either real or perceived abandonment in their upbringing. And this looks like they could have a parent who, leaves or passes away at some young age. Or it could be that there are 2 very loving parents, but they work a lot. So they're constantly traveling for work. So this child grows up to really have positive conditioning about love and really want that love and connection, because when it's there, it's really nice. But there's this background conditioning of feeling like love is always taken away. Love is there, love is taken away. Parents are there, they're traveling a lot. Parents are there, they're traveling a lot. Repetition and emotion is what conditions our subconscious mind. And literally, these are our subconscious set of rules about love. We're not consciously deriving these things and thinking them through as adults. They're these natural programs that we've acquired. And so what ends up happening is somebody from an anxious attachment household grows up to be quite afraid of abandonment. And they often have these big wounds around feeling afraid of being abandoned, disliked, rejected, excluded, and they really cope with these things by trying to maintain proximity. So as adults, these are the individuals who sometimes can be needy or clingy in relationships and call a lot or text a lot and really derive a lot of their sense of self-worth from closeness to other people, rather than having this more deep intrinsic sense of self, which can make them very sensitive to rejection and very afraid of people leaving them. On the other end of the continuum is our dismissive avoidant, basically the opposite of the anxious attachment style. They grow up with this overarching theme of childhood emotional neglect. And so what happens is a child, when they need that attunement, biologically we're wired for attunement and attentiveness from our caregivers. When that's not there because parents are emotionally unavailable, this child grows up to go, there must be something wrong with me that I can't get this need met. And so they actually internalize a lot of shame. And sometimes emotional neglect isn't like very overt. Sometimes it's not like, oh, the parents are never there. The vast majority of the time, it's very covert. It's like, at school on time, food is on the table, everything's good. But if you cry, go in the other room and come back when you're ready to stop crying. Or children should be seen and not heard. Or don't be a crybaby, toughen up, stiff upper lip. Like these types of messaging cause a child to be like, okay, this emotional part of myself is wrong and I need to divorce myself from it. And so this child grows up to basically try to stay as far away as they can from their own emotions, because this is their adaptation to cope with that kind of childhood. So they get afraid of too much attachment and too much closeness because it makes them feel vulnerable and emotional, and they associate that with being weak and shameful. So this adult becomes somebody who's constantly keeping people at arm's length. And if people get too close, they like really push them away. And of course, it's often that anxious and dismissive avoidants end up in relationships together and get into this push-pull cycle of like, come close, and the other person's like, get back. And then last but not least, we have the fearful avoidant, sometimes referred to as the disorganized attachment style. This is what I was growing up. And this attachment style is characterized by having a lot of chaos in childhood. So it could be like a bad divorce, an addict parent, an alcoholic parent. The overarching theme is like you never really know what you're going to get in your household. Sometimes there can be really loving and nice experiences, and other times there's like chaotic and confusing experiences. And so this child grows up to like want love and closeness and yearn for it, and they share in that anxious side. Like they want that closeness, they're afraid of people pulling away, but they also, just like the dismissive avoidant, fear closeness. So it's this funny dichotomy of like, I want closeness, and then somebody gets close and you're like, wait, get back. And you can't really tell which side of the fence you're on. So fearful avoidants tend to be very hot and cold in relationships, tend to be very push-pull. They can be very present and giving, but they can really withdraw and retreat a lot in relationships. And they tend to feel very confused. Like, do I want closeness or do I not want closeness? And they flip-flop a lot as adults, which obviously makes them quite confusing partners to be with. But the best news of all of this is that no matter what your attachment style is, you can heal to become securely attached. And it not only heals the relationship to yourself, but actually will transform completely your relationships to others too.
Yeah, it's a great, great definition and breakdown, and highly recommend, to gather more information on this, go to the YouTube channel, just go down the rabbit hole, because you break down intimacy you break down like how they see themselves, how they receive love, like all these types of things. And I found myself thinking about the earliest version of me in relationships and the chaos that I created because I was so confused.
Yeah.
And I think I was exactly what you described, which is the chaotic, yeah, 100%. And it's that need for the attention, but then being afraid that it's going to go away, or there's no real safety, and you're constantly seeking safety.
Yes.
And yet you don't find it in someone else. You have to find it internally first. Like you have to create that internal version. And so I think we heal ourselves as we get older, as the more we learn about ourselves. I always say I'm very grateful that I met my wife after I had, screwed up a couple of relationships, because it allowed me to learn what was acceptable, what was unacceptable, what I needed to feel. And I've said this on the show before, but it's listening to the styles also is really interesting, because if you are the partner that gets into a disagreement, I'm the one that wants to talk it all out. Like I want to go right now, right? I go as deep as we can go. Like I'm breaking down your parents in 5 seconds of your relationship. Like, tell me about your mother. What was she like? Did you feel loved by your mom? Do you, and people open up to you. Like part of being a podcaster, like it's awesome. We get some of the greatest uh conversations because people feel safe, because I will talk about things other people won't talk about, and there's a safety to it. Um, but in listening to that, I will not go into the way what I think my wife might be, or what, I actually sent her 2 videos. I said, pick me and pick you, and of your YouTube channel. So I'll have fun with that later after the interview. But
Wait, what do you think
um
she was? What do you think she is?
I think she's dismissive. I think she's dismissive.
Yeah.
But but I would let her define that. Like I think that, but at the end of the day, we married 21 years, and honestly, we're really a great match, and we've grown together. I could tell you right now, I probably broke up with her in a long distance relationship every weekend. Every weekend. And
This
every
was
single
me before my
I
husband. This was me in every past relationship before him.
yeah,
I did the work
yeah.
before my husband now, but I totally relate to you.
Yeah, so I would break up with her, and then she would call me. She stopped taking my calls. Like this was pre-texting, thank God, by the way, because I can't imagine what I could have written. But I would get a call from her the next morning, and she'd say, "Are you over yourself?" And I would say, "Yeah, I'm sorry." And we would move on.
Good for her.
And
Good
I
for
would not be married. We would not have the family we have. We would not be great parents together. We learned each other's strengths and our blind spots, and we grew together. And there's still remnants of those things as we get older. There are times where you hit really, really challenging moments, and you might fall back on some of them. But I found it so interesting to listen to this. And I've read about attachment theory back again in the early days of college, and I remembered some of the things, but not to this level. And the way you described it to relationships was so powerful to me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so powerful to understand this, because I think the first part that happens is that we start realizing our own patterns, and we start realizing, oh, my partner doesn't love the way that I love necessarily. And I think that's its own breakthrough. My husband, when we first met too, we had both done a lot of work prior to our relationship. So we definitely had like some secure attachment in there, both of us. And I'm sure that's the case for you and your wife now after 21 years.
I don't know that we had it early. I think just to interrupt for 1 second, I would imagine that we built it together,
Yeah.
and I'm very grateful because we got married in our early 20s. So we were still figuring it out, but we figured it out together.
Yeah, which
And
is
we had
so
commitment,
beautiful.
which is crucial.
Yes. And with commitment and the willingness to learn and do the work, we can adapt. And so like there's the hard way of doing things, which is probably the way that you end up doing it, which is committing but never giving up and learning things through like the hard way and tough discussions. And then there's like a much hopefully easier way for anybody listening, which is like you don't have to feel around in the dark, you can just recognize, oh, this is my attachment style. These are my fears. These are my needs. These are my emotional patterns. These are what I need to do with my boundaries and communication. And this is my partner, and this is their rules for love. And not only can we change the fears and concerns that are not serving us, but we can also make sure that we're learning each other's fears and concerns, and have healthy strategies to work through them. And that's really the system that we built, is to help people shortcut that what can be a very difficult and long process. The process that I went through took me about 3-4 years to figure it out, because I didn't have a sort of framework and shortcut. And it's funny because my husband, by the way, is when we met, he was dismissive avoidant. So we share the same pairing, the fearful avoidant and
Yeah.
dismissive avoidant, and they make for good matches together. Absolutely. But it also, you have to do that work. Otherwise it's going to be really tricky, because you can also have like, you can really hit each other's pain points in the relationship if you're not aware of it too. So the system we built was really, how can we shortcut this process? So once we learn our attachment style and the way that we love, we realize not everybody loves the way that we love. Fearful avoidants love through depth, right? They love through like, let's get down to the root cause. They're really good at making people feel seen, and they're drawing information out of people and having that transparency and deep connection. But dismissive avoidants love through often acts of service
Yeah.
and more indirect, less vulnerable things. And they're very grounding, and they'll tell it how it is for you. And that's their way of loving a lot of the time. And anxious attachment styles love through like being so thoughtful, and they tend to love through like being very, very giving, and sometimes a little too people pleasing for their own good. But once we realize, oh, people love differently than we do, if we have a different attachment style, we can learn their rules for love, our rules for love, and how to work those out, but also how to change the rules that are no longer working for us. So things that would have probably caused you, for example, or myself in past relationships, to break up with somebody all the time, like these ideas that, well, I'm always going to be abandoned or betrayed anyways eventually. So the more I get close to somebody, the more, as a fearful avoidant, I would be terrified. It was scary. It was like, oh my gosh, I know the more I love, the more I'm just going to be hurt. So this you have this like bittersweet experience of being in love or falling in love, where it's nice, but it's terrifying and overwhelming, and it causes you to need to push people away out of self-protection. And so when we realize like, oh, those rules are dysfunctional rules, let's reprogram them and change them, it really opens up this capacity for us to heal and thrive in relationships in a much easier way.
Yeah, it's so important to have the awareness. And I think in when you grow up the way that I did, I tend to I'm diagnosing things like 10 minutes ahead, or sometimes 5 years ahead. And so the challenge is, it's great when you're a CEO and you're building a company. It's great when you're looking so far and you're watching trends, but when you see them in a relationship, you're definitely intense, and that intensity can be a lot. And it's funny, we have some friends that occasionally, that very close friends, and they would say things like, the wife will sometimes say, why don't you more like Scott? And I'll look at her and I'll be like, if he was more like Scott, you would have been divorced in like 30 seconds. Like, the two of us together would have completely broken the world. And you have to have that balance. So the benefit is having someone like my wife who balances me, who will say, hey, let's not tell everyone we're going to do something over the next 3 days. Let's have a night where we go to bed early, we eat a quiet dinner at home, we like that. And I wake up and you feel so much better the next day. But I almost needed that equilibrium, that balancing, and it allows you to start to see things about yourself through the other person. And I think that's what you're describing. And I did not do any work ahead of time, but we definitely worked it out together, which I think is fun. But as I listen to your breakdowns, even the stuff that goes into the strengths, like some of these things are really great strengths. It's not always that it's blind spots, right? These are things that people can leverage and utilize in their careers, with their families, as mothers, as fathers. And as long as it doesn't go into the crazy part where it gets really challenging.
So why don't we talk about strengths for a minute? Because I'd love to share them with, because it's funny, I tend to go into like all the, here's the 5 major categories of how we change our attachment style and break them down and dig into them, but I never really talk about people's strengths. And I think that's
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I'd love to share
love
that.
it.
So what a beautiful topic too. So The anxious attachment style, their strengths are that they get along with everybody. They are friendly, they are charming, they're very likable because they spend so much time like focusing on their interpersonal relationships. They tend to, even if they're shy and introverted, they still, when you connect with them, they're very charming as friends. They're very thoughtful, very kind, very considerate. They really think about how their actions are affecting people all the time. They're great at like interpersonal relationships in the workplace. They work really, really well with teams. They're very good at thinking about what everybody's feeling in a team and showing up for them. I think anxious attachment styles honestly make great managers because they're hyper aware of the social and interpersonal dynamics. So they are absolutely lovely. And that's their huge strength. Their challenges are often that they people please to the point of self abandonment and then get frustrated and sometimes hold on too tightly to things, which accidentally push people away. Dismissive avoidance, their strengths, like you were mentioning about your wife, and my husband definitely shares this too, is that they're very anchoring. They're very grounded. They're very practical. They're very good at like thriving in comfort and security, and they're very stable people generally. They don't let their emotions like take them for a ride. They don't get out of hand. They'll tell it how it is. They're direct. They'll be really honest, which I think is a fantastic quality. Like you can really count on them for their true opinion. And they tend to be really good at being assertive, and they tend to be very intelligent because they've kind of divorced originally their emotional faculties a little bit. So they're hyper intellectual a lot of the time. Really good problem solvers, really good at finding solutions to things. Fearful avoidance, to your point, it's so funny how like it just people share so much in common when they have a similar attachment style. But to your point, I think you just nailed it. Fearful avoidance are usually living 5 steps ahead. So a lot of times they live in the future because if you grew up in a chaotic childhood, you had to predict everything. So fearful avoidance make great CEOs, great entrepreneurs because they thrive outside of their comfort zone. They actually tend to kind of get exhausted by being in too much of a routine. Like they like to roll with the punches. They like the novelty, the exploration, the growth. They tend to be people who I think thrive the most around personal growth because they will just go head first. Like personal growth, personal development. Fearful ones love that stuff. Like once they sink their teeth into it, they will go so deep into things. And they tend to make people feel very cared about. They're great in a crisis. Nobody will show up like a fearful avoidant in a crisis. And they are really good at being resourceful, resilient, and making sure that they are strategic and really good at solving problems in outside of the box in creative ways. And it's funny because so much of the training for all these different things are built in childhood, are built through how we were conditioned and how we were socialized. And so they can be very intense, which can be a good thing, or sometimes not so great of a thing if they have to learn to kind of calm down and balance and rest. But yeah, those are some of the strengths of all 3 styles. And you really kind of touched on those in passing. And I think it's such an important topic to actually share with people listening too.
Well, it's interesting because the older I got, the more I realized that that intensity, that infectious energy, like the things that people thrive off of, are also things that you lose so much of yourself in a day. And so I always call it I'm a sprinter. Like I'm not an endurance runner, I'm a sprinter. And sprinters need to rest after short spurts
Spurts.
of energy,
Yeah.
and they can sprint up to certain meters, they can sprint, but once you get up to the point where it turns into like over a mile, there's no way to sprint at that level. And if you're building a business, building a relationship, anything that's worth having for a long time, you have to understand that. And so, I talk all the time about my morning routine with, I read scripture in the morning, I do a sauna, I do a cold plunge, I work out first, then do those things. And I leverage that time to almost slowly ease into the day because that level of intensity can be so extreme that if I start early, I'm so exhausted as the day goes on. And that means that I'm not the husband, I'm not the father, I'm not the version of myself that I want to be. And so as a as a growth mechanism, I learned that, years ago in different versions. And today it's a lot easier to perfect. As the kids get older, I get a little more time to myself, and that helps a little bit. But um, I find that to be very valuable, understanding those strengths, but then being aware of the challenges and the landmines you could step on that may revert you back to feeling the way that you did when you were younger.
100%. And to your point, fearful avoidant attachment styles, like, and when we change, right? So like, let's say we work to become securely attached, and we can talk about like how to do that if you'd like, but when we work to become securely attached, we don't really change in terms of like our needs. We don't really change in terms of our emotions and like our personality. Like, fearful avoidants tend to be hyper passionate about things, throw themselves headfirst into things, learn on the way, like, and so like learn as they go, not like necessarily be super over prepared. Like, there's a lot of these sort of background things that are so concise and consistent in parallels across fearful avoidance. But to your point, like, that's brilliant. Like, I do the same thing. I literally make sure that I do my morning routine first, because I'm also a sprinter, and I totally understand. I like that analogy a lot. But you'll see fearful avoidance, for example, they can sprint. And I really had to learn this the hard way a few times in early life and starting my first business. And it was that I would just overcommit to everything, try to sprint my way through everything because I cared and I was passionate. It was interesting to me. And then I would be like, oh my goodness, I am exhausted. And then you pay for it later. And so having the ability to really understand your patterning, because a lot of those things won't change. What does change when we recondition our attachment style are our core wounds, these fears we have about being betrayed, abandoned, not good enough, unworthy, like those core ideas. And then if we have painful communication patterns or we struggle with boundaries, like those things we can actually transform. But a lot of the personality traits and the needs that we have won't necessarily shift. So we want to be able to leverage those important qualities about ourselves and understand those about ourselves and how we can best support ourselves through that, while also working to recondition what's not serving us.
It's always so interesting to me because I have a viewpoint of my parents and my family, and both my parents are still together. They love each other. They're alive. I'm very grateful. Um, and they're imperfect parents. My mom will listen to this, and she listens to every show and then calls me and tells me why she loved this guest or what she did. And
That's so
so
sweet.
it's actually really fun to talk about it. But I have this viewpoint that I really admire them for being who they were. And even if it was imperfect in moments, I have a very good understanding of what makes them tick and how I can help them as they age and how they can help me. My buddy called me today. His mom passed several years ago. He goes, she was very anxious. She was, I mean, all over him about a lot of things and really challenged to allow him to grow up. And he said, I didn't think I needed my mom until recently. I have daughters. I have all these parts of my life that now I feel like I'm missing a part of her, that even though it wasn't very healthy, I'd love to be able to share it with her. I'd love to be able to talk to her. And so if when we see the imperfection, but we understand it, and we also understand that the parents do the best job they can do. Like, they're reacting to how they were raised. They're breaking down. It's generational a lot of times. And so the more we heal ourselves, no matter when we do it, I would imagine the better we're helping the next generation to heal that next generation. I mean, that's how I at least envision it.
I completely agree with this. And I honestly believe that a part of our attachment style healing is healing the relationships with our parents. So, our grievances, the things where we were like, oh, the things we haven't forgiven or the things that we're holding on close to our heart and resenting for, I believe it is powerful personal growth work and almost spiritual work to sit down and be like, let me take a different look. Let me look at this from an adult perspective. Let me look at what I can understand about my parents. I spend a lot of time in some of our programs taking people through, we have a course called Learning to Release Resentment and Truly Forgive, because I think we hear this like intellectualization of forgiveness a lot that says, oh, just forgive them, just let it go. And it's like, yeah, but when you're actually not feeling that way, how do you arrive there? And I give people tools in this particular course. And one of the first things we do, and people spend a lot of time doing this with their parents, is I get them to sit down and be like, okay, you had this experience as a child, but what were your parents' sponsoring intentions when they were doing this thing? So, for example, if you had a really controlling parent, what were their sponsoring intentions? You think when you're a child, oh, they're just trying to control me. rude, I'm going to rebel. And as an adult, you see, oh, they were trying to protect me and they were afraid of losing me. And that was them doing the best that they could. And or if parents were really critical, well, they were probably trying to prepare you to survive in the world because maybe they struggled financially and they didn't want that for you. And I find that looking at sponsoring intentions is so valuable. And then taking it a step deeper and being like, well, what was their childhood? What were their core wounds? What were their challenges and pain points that were unresolved as parents? And I think that we actually have this really important rite of passage that, funnily enough, some people don't really go through until much later in life or ever. But we have a rite of passage to look at our parents not as these individuals on a pedestal, but actually to just see them as other human beings doing the best that they could. And if somebody listening to this right now hasn't done that work yet, that is powerful work to do, because we can release resentment, which is really just our own like poison and chains to the past. And I find that whatever we haven't released from our parents will unfortunately always show up in our relationships as adults with our romantic partners. And so it's very powerful and important work on the topic of parents to actually look at some of these things that we're holding on to. And until we learn to actually forgive and understand our parents are just human beings doing the best that they can, these things will come out in different ways in our relationships as adults.
Yeah, it's something that I think I told myself. So when I wrote my book, I'll say my first, I haven't written the next one, but I will. So when I wrote the first book, you go through, it's almost therapeutic. I've never been to therapy. I've had coaches. I've gone through lots of personal development. Um, but it's therapeutic. You go through all these things. And one of the first exercises I went through was I was asked a question. Think of all the times you failed and what was the result of it, right? And I started to go through all these failures, and I forgot like so many things. Like I came home and asked my wife, and she's like, "Oh, did you remember this? Do you remember that?" And not in a bad way, like in a like, "Wow, you overcame this." When I say failure, I don't mean failure like I did something and didn't win. I mean like it was a challenge. It was severely uncomfortable, or I lost a job, or like, those things. And, but going through that and looking at it, I found, a couple of big things that were evident to the parents. Number one was, I experienced I witnessed a sexual trauma and a rape when I was very young, about 3 years old. It was extremely impactful to me, and the and I had not really thought much about it
Mm.
until I started to go through this process. Really interesting, right? And the other thing I started to think about is how it impacted my family. How did it impact the way my parents raised me? How did it impact the way they raised my sister? How did it impact the way that they protected us? I was never allowed to spend the night at anyone's house. I was like, there was an enormously,
Wow.
completely altered state
Yeah.
to our family that I never really thought about. When my brother came 13 and a half years later, same parents, there was a peace that came over our family. It was almost like my parents got a redo. My sister and I all united over this great new life. And there was a change. But so the first insight was this therapeutic process of going through something internally, seeing how it impacted my life in mostly positive ways. The
Yeah.
challenge was the challenge, and the experience was the experience. I remembered a lot of the bad parts,
Mhm.
but I also saw all the things that came about because of it. The second thing was this. I would read my words back, and when I would describe a story, one particular story, I'm walking with my father, and he's riding his bike to work in his uniform. He's blue collar, super guy. He has his lunch pail. It's 103 degrees outside. We're walking from the babysitters. He was riding his bike to and from work. I don't know if it was 1 month, 1 week, a year. I have no concept of it. I just remember thinking, I was asking him all these questions like, there's got to be a better way. I'm probably like 6 years old, 8 years old. And I'm like, what are we doing? Like, this has got to, he's sweating. He looks uncomfortable. And I'm trying to solve a problem. And when I read it the first time, I had this aggression about my tone. When I read it, when I did the second edit, I had released a little bit of this frustration, and it was a relaxed, it was more relaxed. And by the third edit, he was almost heroic.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about that is it was me listening to how I was self-talking to myself, how I was telling myself a story. And you have kids. The last thing I'll say, and I'll pause because I know you have insight. The last thing I'll say is when you have children, you realize one really important, impactful thing, and that is there are two sides to every story. There are two sides to every story. The way the child perceives it, like you said, with intent. If we look at the intent, what you don't know as a child is what your parents were doing behind the scenes,
Yes.
or what they tried to do, or how the result ended in a certain way. And so that process of writing was so valuable to me. And it was such a personal journey, even though it's probably one page in the book. Like, you have no idea as the reader what I was going through, but it was valuable to see my family, especially my father, in a different light, and to let go of some things. Even though I had let go many, many years ago, I hadn't let go of the tone. The
Yeah.
tone had to change.
So I love this. I absolutely love this topic. I actually have done a ton of work on this topic. These are actually principles of post-traumatic growth. And if you don't mind, I would actually love to turn what you said into an exercise for listeners, because this is such a powerful experience. So whenever we have trauma, the mind has to make it mean something, because at the end of the day, we're survival wired. So especially the subconscious mind, we tend to give meaning to things and store meaning of things, because this is how we make sense of it. So this experience, right? And people might have heard you say, like, you talked about witnessing a rape when you were a 3-year-old, and like, that's a big T trauma. That's a real trauma. And then you went on a moment later to say there were some good things that came out of it. And people are probably like, what? But like, this is a real thing. And this is actually one of the biggest cornerstones of why people experience what is known as post-traumatic growth. And when we are willing to look at a difficult experience without necessarily having to go back there and relive the entire memory, when we can see the experience, we can ask ourselves a series of some really powerful questions that will get people to exactly what you just said, which is, how did I grow from this? What did I learn? What was I forced to let go of that no longer served me? And how did I adapt and that turn into a strength? And what you'll see, and I'm curious if this was your experience, because there's two big pieces of post-traumatic growth here, and we'll do the second one in a moment. But the first one, I'm curious from your experience. Like, you're a 3-year-old, your subconscious mind stores everything. And I'm sure that from what I've learned about you from our discussion just so far, that you, because of seeing that, probably adapted in ways that you probably came to realize later that were, I became really good at solving problems. I probably became a protector of other people, I would imagine, as an adult, and really went out of my way to make sure that people were good, people were safe. Like, I'm curious what came out that you saw more specifically that served you for the rest of your life, having been through something so big and traumatic at 3 years old.
Yeah, I think it's connection and protection. So at the end of the day, I learned connection as a defense mechanism,
Yeah.
because the more I was connected, the more I understand your intent, and the more I could
Nailed
understand what
it.
was important. And number two was protection. And that was, if no one's going to protect me, I will lead everyone.
Yeah.
And so I took that on almost to a fault for many, many years. But I'm very grateful for the protection side. I love helping my family. I love leading our family. And so and when I say, I want to say this for the listeners, when I say something good came out of it, I meant from a personal standpoint. I
Yeah.
still think about the challenge that must be for that young woman and the experience all the time. So I always also found it a blessing that I wasn't the person that was physically harmed. Like,
Yeah.
even those things were things that I could find in that moment. That And my parents were amazing. I mean, my mom was, this is always worth saying, I've talked about it before, but she went to a family doctor who said I would give him time. I wouldn't give him therapy right now. I'd give him time. And every time he wants to talk about it with me. And she would celebrate, she would listen, she would talk through it. My dad would not, but she would. And it was very powerful. Then years later, she would tell me all the great things the young lady was doing in her life and how
Oh,
successful she was.
wow.
It was a very, very, there's a
Healing.
lot of things that my mom isn't perfect at, like every one of us, right? But she handled it with perfection. I'm very grateful of that. It allowed me to see my mom in a different light. So there's so many things that you can, I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking because I'm very introspective. I'm very, I like to learn and be curious, but also about myself and understand how to be a better version of this person that's born.
Absolutely.
That's
And
here.
that's so beautiful. And that's like how we actually grow through things because that's you doing your part of it, right? Like ideally, the poor woman who went through that, of course, but ideally, hopefully, she would be able to have the opportunity at some point to also do some of that work and find out like how she grew. Maybe she grew and had to do a lot of therapy, but maybe that brought her into deeper parts of herself later on that served her in many other ways, and it's not. I want to really illustrate here, and I know you know this, but for anybody listening, it's not to take away from the negative. It's to see the whole picture because
Right.
what happens is we get spliced during traumatic events. We fragment memories into one side, and we only store the experience of the past as a one-sided memory, or like you said earlier, a one-sided story. And so much of post-traumatic growth healing is us going back, and we know because this is what the human mind does. We will adapt. We will let go of things that don't serve us. We will grow in different ways because that's human. That's like how we evolve. And so if we're willing to go back and look at hard times and be like, how did this serve me in some way? It's never to contradict or counteract that there was extreme hardship for people. It's to honor that there are two sides to the story and help ourselves come full circle to see the whole. And so that's one really important part of post-traumatic growth. The second part, I'm curious if you've done this work, but for anybody listening, is when we go through a trauma, we give it meaning and we store that meaning about ourselves. And a huge part of healing, I would argue even bigger than that we just talked about, is to learn to change the story of ourselves. And I'm happy to share a tool for reprogramming. But when we go through something, and I'm curious if this was your experience, like in that experience that you shared, right? You see this happening to this person. And I'm sure like one of the big core wounds that we have or pieces of meaning would be, I am helpless, right? Like helpless to fix or change the situation because you're 3 years old. And I actually had a traumatic memory at 3 years old as well, where I saw two people close to me get into a very intense altercation. And that was a big thing for me. Like, I am helpless. And that was a huge core wound. And I carried that throughout my life. And I would constantly go into situations, first of all, trying to oversolve everybody's problems because I was terrified to see people in pain and not be able to do something about it, which of course also served me in certain ways to learn
Yeah.
about people and the human mind. But I actually had to change this narrative that I was carrying about myself as being a helpless person, and learn that, wait, hold on a second, like I'm actually really empowered in lots of different ways. And when we can reprogram the meaning we give to these painful events, because we tend to store that meaning as a core wound, and then that core wound becomes a part of our identity. Healing and reprogramming that is huge, and for different people it's different things. So fearful avoidants often have like, I will be betrayed, I will be abandoned, I'm helpless. These are big fearful avoidant core wounds. I am unsafe, even if just emotionally. Anxious attachments, they're like, I will be abandoned, I'm not good enough, I'm excluded, I'll be disliked and rejected. Dismissive avoidants are like, I'm defective or shameful if I open up, I am weak, I'm trapped in the wrong relationship, I'm emotionally unsafe in a conflict. So we all have these core ideas. And the other layer to really working through from a post-traumatic growth perspective is actually being able to change these narratives that we are carrying deep down about ourselves. And those same narratives, if somebody listening is like, what does that mean? Those same narratives will be the things that trigger you most on a daily basis. So you'll see that if you have this story, I will be betrayed, you're hypersensitive to reading between the lines and seeing anything that could change. Or if you have this wound around being abandoned, that's the thing that triggers you most if somebody doesn't text you back or they pull away. Or if you have this shame wound as a dismissive avoidant, if somebody's critical to you, that's where you will really shut down. So these core ideas that we have about ourselves, that other layer of post-traumatic growth work is changing what's no longer serving, while seeing in that second layer that whole picture and looking for what came out on the other side of the story.
Yeah, it's super powerful, and it's great to have conversations where you can explore things. And I think sharing stories like that allow people to see themselves in their own story, their own challenge. Something that everybody has their own experiences that have negatively and positively impacted them. But when you look at your parents and you look at all of the things that kind of make you where we started here was how, as parents, we're impacting our children in so many ways. And so as you were talking, there are things that you could start to see in your own children as they mature. And how the earliest version, like I love to say that your firstborn is your trial kid, right? Like you are the rawest version of yourself and you don't know anything with the firstborn. And by the time you get to the second kid, you're hopefully a little better. And if you have more, then maybe you're even better. But I definitely I think that it's nice to be able to I like to go back to review, like in any business or anything. Like look back at the gain. Dr. Ben Hardy and Dan Sullivan wrote The Gap and the Gain. And if you always spend life in the gap, you're always looking for what you haven't attained yet. But if you look at the gain, you're kind of saying, hey, I was here and now I'm here. And I'm so proud of that. And I'm so excited that's valuable to me. And I remember where I was and how I felt in that moment. And but doing that is such a healthy exercise as long as we don't stay there too long.
Yeah.
Like I feel like it's like you've got to go back and visit, remember the lesson, and then move on to the next chapter. And that's where experiences become valuable versus that depression or that anxious state if you spend too much time in the future worrying about everything that could happen.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So do you mind if I just share one tool for
yeah, I'd love
reprogramming?
it. Yeah, please.
So this is one of my favorite tools. I think that this is for anybody who hears themselves in these core wounds. I can share, like, whenever I go through small T trauma consistently or big T trauma, whether it's from childhood, attachment trauma, you name it, we have these two major wounds that will come up. These two major sort of like dynamics. There will be the lack of the seeing the whole story, and then there will be these core wounds. I'm going to list off some major core wounds so people can just hear them first. And I'm going to tell us how we can actually reprogram these things. So I've kind of mentioned them. I'll be abandoned, alone, disliked, excluded, rejected, unloved, trapped, helpless, powerless, disrespected. I am stupid is a big core wound for people. I'm not good enough, unworthy, bad. And so if people hear these things, I am unsafe is the last one. If people hear these things and they're like, oh, that's my trigger. That's the thing that triggers me. That's the thing that comes up in my relationships and my daily life. It's because in the past, you either had repeated small T trauma or one or a series of big T trauma. And these things imprint our subconscious mind. And then they show up as triggers and the things that disrupt you on a daily basis. We do not have to live storing all these triggers all of the time. We can actually recondition these ideas. And this is a huge part of not just healing and transforming your attachment style, but actually like changing your relationship to the past. And so, let's say, for example, somebody has a core wound, I am not good enough. Okay, just to make it really simple. Whenever we have this core wound, this will show up in all kinds of places. It'll be the glass ceiling in the workplace. It'll be the glass ceiling in relationships. It'll be the thing that we like overcompensate for, or we get really upset about when it feels like it's pushed on as a one of those buttons or triggers. So we can change these things. And the first thing we want to recognize is that these are not conscious decisions. Nobody's waking up saying, I'm going to tell myself today I'm not good enough 100 times and see how I feel. Like, these are not choices. These are subconscious pre-existing imprints because of trauma. So when we want to rewire these painful ideas, we have to speak to the subconscious mind. Now, the conscious mind speaks language, okay? The subconscious mind speaks emotion and imagery. If I say to you, Scott, whatever you do not think of a chocolate chip cookie. Like, you probably flash an image of a chocolate chip cookie in your brain.
Yeah, plus I love chocolate chip cookies. So yes, 100%.
And so what happens is your conscious mind hears do not, but your subconscious doesn't care. Now, two really important facts when we have these old imprints from past events. Number one, your conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower your subconscious mind. This is why on a daily basis, people will be like, I'm going to quit eating chocolate, or I'm going to go to the gym every day. And then they go back into the same patterns all the time, because our conscious mind can intend, but our subconscious actually shows up and decides whether we're going to do things or not. The second thing is that your conscious mind controls 3 to 5% of all of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and decisions. Your subconscious, 95 to 97%. So we want to learn, hey, if our subconscious has these really painful core wounds, we need to wipe them out. So we've established that the conscious mind speaks language, the subconscious speaks emotion and imagery. Now, how it gets conditioned is it gets wired through repetition and emotion. So what happens is when we're from a neuroplastic perspective, when we look at neuroplasticity, neural pathways are built through repetition and emotion that's repeated. And it's what hardwires these neural networks in. So if we have this old idea, this I'm not good enough, and we're like, we're done with feeling this, or I'll be abandoned or betrayed, or whatever somebody's painful story is, what we want to do is step one, find its opposite. Very simple. I'm not good enough. I am good enough. I'm unloved. I am loved. I'll be abandoned. I'll stay connected. So step one, find its opposite. Step two, we need to speak to the subconscious mind. We need to rewire at the subconscious level. And so what we need is emotion and imagery, because that's what the subconscious speaks. Now, interestingly enough, memory is just a container for emotions and images. If I were to say, tell me your favorite childhood memory, you might be like, I was playing on the playground, and you see the images of the slide and you would smile as you're telling the memory. So, because it's containing your emotions still. So all we need is repetition, emotion, and imagery to reprogram these old ideas that we're done with. So if we can come up with 10 old memories for how we did feel good enough, or things that we did do that were good enough, that's step two. And step three is we record this into our phone, our audio of our phone, and listen back for 21 days, because research shows it takes about 21 days to hardwire these new neural networks. And so if we are done with these old stories from old trauma and the meaning we gave to it, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, I'm always going to be abandoned, and we're like, we want to actually recondition these things, find the opposite of the core wound, 10 pieces of memory to support the opposite, record it, listen back for 21 days, and we can actually change these long-standing beliefs that we have about ourselves that are usually showing up as the glass ceiling in all of our relationships, in the workplace, in our communication patterns, like everywhere we go, we can wipe our hands of them once and for all. And this is a big thing I personally did in healing fearful avoidant attachment style. It's one of the most crucial pillars to changing our attachment style. And it's something that really, really works if people are willing to dive in and take action.
That's great. It's the power of self-talk alone is so interesting because I think so many people just forget how we find ourselves talking to ourselves on a regular basis. And what you just described are three steps that people can do. And part of it is creating that repetitious language that we remind ourselves that we are enough, that we are safe, that we are, a wonderful human, or whatever it is that we need to understand, because we're reframing that for ourselves. But so many of us, so many people in some way are not talking to themselves the way that they would talk to anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a golf course at a PGA, super nice golf course, and I don't belong on any of these golf courses because I'm not good enough. And they put the club pro with me, and he was a phenomenal golfer, like just on the edge of competing at the professional level, but training at the pro place. And after about 4 holes, I listened to this guy talk to himself. And I said, dude, I suck at golf, but I don't sound anywhere near as bad to myself as you do every single time that you get in this cart. And if you sound this bad on the outside, I can only imagine what you're doing on the inside to yourself. And he goes, or he was shocked. And I said, what are you saying to yourself every time you make a bad shot? And he said, I'm really hard on myself. And I said, why don't you change the dialogue and start telling yourself that you practice this all the time, that you know what to do for the next shot, and adjust and adapt. And we had by the time we got to the 18th hole, we had a blast, and had gotten to know each other super well. And I learned some of the challenges he was coping with and all those types of things. But it was so interesting to hear someone on the outside say things to themselves and only imagine what they're saying on the inside. And so many high performers are trying to outwork these things. They're
Yeah.
trying to outwork these challenges. They're trying to outwork, and where they'll get affirmations that are outside of themselves, and then they still feel empty when they receive them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a great reminder just to take a temperature check of how we're talking to ourselves, because it you just described not only how you can help heal, but also how it can be a trait that you could start to develop as something that you're building on, that you become the version of yourself you were meant to be.
100%. And here's something crazy. Your subconscious mind works very hard to maintain its comfort zone. So what will happen is like these ideas, like if somebody has this not good enough wound, right? It's a longstanding belief, then it creates all these patterns of thought. So before the thoughts are actually these core ideas we have. And so, if you believe you're not good enough, you'll tell yourself the story, I'm not smart enough, interesting enough, funny enough, good enough at golf, whatever it might be. And so we'll have this sort of like, the branches coming off of the tree trunk of that belief. Funnily enough, even though your conscious mind can observe it and be like, that's not working for me, that's not the healthiest thing I could be doing, your subconscious mind will work really hard to maintain its comfort zone. So what happens all the time to people is these core wounds become self-fulfilling prophecies because their subconscious is just survival wired. So it'll go, well, we've been surviving. So this story, me beating myself up or being hard on myself, this is working. And we'll actually try to keep going through the same patterns despite them being highly dysfunctional and actually being the things that really are those glass ceilings, like in the golf game or at work or whatever it might be. And so if people look at these core ideas, what often happens is until we actually work through them, they're almost always self-fulfilling prophecies. Like the abandoned core wound, somebody feels afraid of abandonment, so they hold on so tight that they accidentally violate somebody else's boundaries and don't make them feel seen and connected to as their own unique person. And what happens? That person usually pulls away or leaves. Or we fear being betrayed. And so we accuse somebody of something all the time. And eventually they're like, well, geez, whatever. You don't trust me anyways. And that can sabotage relationships. And then we feel betrayed. Or people feel like I'm not good enough. So they don't go for that job interview. They don't, or they penalize themselves so much in advance before getting there that it shuts down their performance. And so these ideas often like come full circle until we're willing to really change, either through belief reprogramming or through, like you were saying, like actually just being more self-observant and introspective with our internal dialogue and working through cognitive reframes.
Yeah, and that works with everything, with dieting, with you know, everything that we want. It can work. I mean, it's so powerful. And by the way, we're all working on it. So nobody is sitting here telling you on this show. I can assure you, there's lots of things I'm still working on every day, and there's lots of self-talk I can get better at. And so, I humbly come to everybody listening to this show as somebody that's just sharing a part of our journey so that you hopefully have something that's interesting, or one piece helps you live a better life. And it's all about life at the end of the day: love, impact, faith, and energy. For me, giving up and surrendering to God and something bigger than myself has been the ultimate value add. So thinking I could control everything was the biggest mistake of my entire life. And once I realized that it was a greater there's a greater power than me, even though I've always known it, I didn't fully engage to the level that I needed. Such a relief, such a release, and so, and I know we briefly spoke. We don't have time to go into that right now because I know we're up against the wall on time. But
I would love to say
um,
one thing if that's okay.
say it. I want you to.
There's this part, right? And where when we try to control everything, it's like the ego mind is in competition with God, right? The ego mind is like, it's got to be my way. And I'm wondering if you had this experience, but when I personally myself surrendered to a higher power and really built like a real personal relationship to God, I can tell you how many times I would have these experiences being like, I want it to be this way. And then it wouldn't go that way. And I would be like, thank God. Like that was not meant for me. That path wasn't supposed to be what it was. And I think sometimes that trust really gets built in our relationship to God through being able to observe that like little us is trying to control the universe. And then when we're able to say, you know what, I'm going to surrender to what happens next. I'm still going to do my best and show up for everything that I can control that's healthy to work on. But recognizing those things that are out of my control, surrender to those, and that extra peace that comes through life, but also the amount of times you're like, okay, I'm not so attached to outcomes anymore, because when it doesn't go my way, sometimes that's even better than anything else I could have imagined.
Yeah, and it takes work every day. I mean, it is all it takes is flying somewhere and it not going your way, and you immediately are like, "Wait a second. What? I planned everything here." And so life just doesn't work that way. Life is imperfect just like we are. And you teach so many great things. How do people find you? What's the best way to join your community? How can we do the work on ourselves with you and your team? What would you recommend for the listeners out there?
Yeah. So I am at personaldevelopmentschool.com. We put a big focus area on how to heal your attachment style, like actually change your attachment style to become secure. And if anybody wants to like do a deeper dive into some of that, they can go to personaldevelopmentschool.com/free trial if they want to just test out a program for free and see how they like it. And then I'm on YouTube every single day at Personal Development School Thais Gibson. There's a daily YouTube video out, and on Instagram, which is at personal development _ school.
So when you do a ton of YouTube videos, the first thing that everybody needs to know is there are people that act, and there are people that teach and are authentic. I watched one of your videos. You sneezed in the video and kept going and didn't cut it out. And I thought it was the coolest thing, because I've done so many things in videos where I'm like, oh, we need to edit that out. And then the fact that there was real life in there makes for such it's a truth. It's real.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm not even joking, but I thought in my brain, I was like, that's valuable. And you're probably going, how the hell did I not edit that out
No,
now? I
I
forgot.
actually knew that.
Oh,
I do them all
okay.
in one take. I usually, because I feel like it's more honest that way, in like a funny way.
Yes,
And
it's real.
I sneeze. I'm a human being.
Yeah. Hey, guess what? It happens. People will be like, but you'll have people that will come up and be like, I can't believe that you probably didn't know. You sneezed in a video, and I know you didn't mean to have that. I mean, it's so embarrassing.
Oh, I'm like, it's fine.
People,
It's
I love it.
fine.
I think it's great. So I just think people like to tell you what you could change, but you're real. You're putting out great stuff. Follow social media. Get on YouTube. Download a couple of videos and just look at what is your attachment style, like where do you fit in. And I think there's some really good healing recipes in this podcast, so share it with somebody, because it could be the game changer for someone. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for being a part of the show today. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.